welcome back to another episode of the Shop Talk, which is now being basically deemed AkersMachine by the community. So this week we are discussing like list composition and just model selection for lists and how to just be successful with a balanced list pairing. So first thing I wanted to kind of go over and kind of my descriptors as far as how I go about breaking down a list. You typically have the feature of the list is your basic your big centerpiece. So how you build is like the piece that defines the list, whether that be a gargantuan, a colossal, a character heavy, battle engines, things like that. Models that really define what your mechanic, what you're looking at doing. And then you have the supporting cast, which is your other heavies, your lights, your combat units, combat solos, things are basically your other like do work models, work models in the list, and that typically is the bulk of your list is going to be in this category of the supporting cast. And then you have what I kind of call this the stage crew, which is like your non-combat solos, your supporting units that are just support models in general. Like they are typically non-combatants, where like they're your empower bots or just your extra kind of filler models that round out your list for the hone in against the weaknesses. So that's typically, like I said, the three main groups of how I categorize, from which every model falls into one of those three groups. And then from there, we can go into the kind of main areas that people build pairings into. So I would say typically the main lists of pairings that people use are a all-comers list, which is more of you're going to play that in the 90% of the games obviously out there. And then they build their secondary list as a countermeasure against someone teching for obviously either their army or their list in general. And that typically works for like smaller, more localized steamrollers where you're kind of everybody who's going to be there. And if people are obviously kind of gunning for your army, you can have your core list you enjoy to play, or that's it's really good and hyper competitive. And then you have a change up list that you can rotate in and out, with every event to try to change it up and keep your opponents a little off balance by constantly iterating with other things. Then you have some lists that are just to try to be as broad as possible, where both casters and both lists are an all-comers like catch-all style list, which in general is good in the fact that it covers as many things as possible, and you're trying to get as broad of coverage, and like I don't have a bad matchup anywhere, which is great. But on the flip side of that, though, as a con, you're just kind of middle of the road, and you're not really teched into anything. And also the situation you run into a lot of those situations is the fact that you're always going to favor one list over the other. As you get more comfortable, as you play more games, one list is always going to rise over the other one. So the other lists will just kind of be there for show, where you have no need to actually be even playing that. So that's the issue that I typically have found with that style of build. The list pairing that I have found to be most successful with, and the archetype of that is I play a all-comers list. So I have a list that's going to cover again 90% of the meta, but also run as my secondary list a hard skew list. And a skew can be, the armor skew. It can be a defensive skew. It can be, mass stealth. Just something that asks a hard question of your opponent. And typically, I have found that this is the most successful, just because both of your lists have a place now. Where going into a matchup, if you're running a hard skew, you look at your hard skew list first and say, can my opponent deal with my hard skew? Can they deal with my speed, or can they deal with my armor and my boxes? And if the answer is yes, then you can go into your all comers list and just play that game. If they can't, then you can just basically profit and drop your skew list and go that way. So now you have clear channels on what both of your lists want to do, and they're not competing with each other on which one to play where. So you have clear defined roles for both of your lists. So that's why I've found that is the overall the best situation there. What's not, again, it's just my personal preference, and it's just my experience but it's not always the case. And so going off of that, does anyone have any other archetypes as far as list pairings go that they have found that don't fall into one of those three that is working for them, or they have seen before? No? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the most common ones that I've found. So if you do, like I said, feel free to chime in. If not, then we can just go right into just list building in general. So the first thing I do, obviously, when I'm sitting down to build a list, I am looking through my army's core identity. So I look through and say, okay, what is my army naturally good at? Whether it be shooting, whether it be having extreme threat ranges, whether it be melee damage or range damage, or all of that. Like, what is my core identity of my army, and how can I amplify that even farther? Because typically, when you're building a competitive list, obviously for a con setting, things of that nature, you're wanting to build and bring the best that your faction has to offer. So what you're looking for is just multiple units that fall under one of those categories, where, okay, I have this jack that has like multiple arms that are great weapons, or I have this really good weapon on this one jack, and I'm gonna play two of those, and that could be my feature jack, where I'm gonna bring this, and then I'll support and bubble wrap those models with my supporting cast, which I kind of alluded to earlier, and just making that work. And then you bring the support again to just tune up all of those other do work models, and so you can keep them in the fight longer. And that's kind of what you're looking for when I'm building my first list. Is like, all right, I'm looking for my core identity of my army. What is my faction naturally good at, and then how can I exploit that even farther? And then by doing that, that's kind of how the list starts to take shape from there. So all right, I'm going to pick these two weapons and these two jacks that I'm going to use these to exploit, which I'm going to go with Orgoth, because that's where I've been playing most recently, where you have that hunter head quad bolt thrower Belcher jack. It is a great weapons platform, arguably one of the best weapon platforms currently in the game out there. And so being able to exploit that gun is one of the best. I see one of the best things that that army has to offer. So looking at that, now how do I make that better? Where you have a number of different ways that you can do that, whether it be with Harusk with the rerolls to attack and damage rolls, or you have some casters that can buff or debuff, obviously, your targets to allow extra damage to go through. So you're looking for ways how to stack what you already have that's really good in your faction identity and get that to the next level. So on top of that, after you get, you locked in on what your feature element's going to be, you start looking now at, all right, now how do I keep these in the fight as long as I can? So then you start looking at, like I said, your supporting cast, your supporting elements of bringing in extra heavies to buffer them, bringing in combat units to keep stuff away from your elements there, because obviously those are your most valuable pieces in your list, and you typically are building your list for these elements. Laman, do you have a question? Okay, I'll continue on. Keep building for these elements here. So by doing so, these should always be typically the last pieces that you lose in a game, because you're the most cautious and the most careful with when you commit these pieces, and making sure that you're getting max efficiency out of them every turn. And everything else kind of just funnels around those elements, whether it be, like I said, the combat solos, your combat units, everything's kind of just basically bodyguards those pieces until you don't have the buffering left from taking damage and things of that nature. And then once you have your core list kind of mapped out on what you're looking at, that's when you start going into the skew portion of, okay, and that's also kind of when you're looking at like the meta itself, where if you know the players you're going to be seeing typically, or knowing the likelihood of what factions you're going to see, especially in Mark IV, seeing what's popular as far as Orgoth, as far as Storm Legion, Legion itself, like all the popular things, and even obviously Magnus and Invictus now being so heavily played, you want to have a game plan for those specific things, and by building that into a skew list to try to counter some of those prevalent models and prevalent casters out there. So typically, like I said, it doesn't really matter as much what your skew is, as long as you're able to get at least, I would say you'd want 60 to 70% of your army devoted to that identity of, whether it be armor and boxes, whether it be defensive skew of 14 defense and above, whether it be your damage output, as far as playing as many weapon masters as possible, like just kind of getting to a point of like, all right, I'm going to send this at you. Do you have a list that's readily available to deal with this, or do I have to play a fair game into you? So that's pretty much the extent of the list composition, kind of like the basics of obviously what you're looking at as far as how you're organizing and how you're looking at different things. And typically what you're also looking towards, and what I found the most beneficial too, is don't build your list looking for like how to answer and solve other armies. because in a tournament setting, you may never even see those armies. There's a chance that you don't get matched up against the Storm Legion, or you don't get matched up against some of this stuff. So typically, what you're focusing on is being proactive and not reactive. And just by what I mean by that is you're building your list in an aggressively minded way. So you're looking at your models, and so your model selection, say, okay, well, how can I basically take up the most space? How can I basically project my army as best I can, and not so much how do I stay safe and how do I do this? Because by playing aggressively and kind of looking at that, from a different perspective, you're forcing your opponent to play on your terms, which is what you want in a game. Like forcing your opponent to fight the way you want the to be fought. Like you're looking for this angle and being able to dictate how this game goes. Being reactive, in my experience, is a harder spot to come back from once you get to a point where you're just basically waiting for your opponent's next move. If you're able to force where they stand and force where they fight, you are always going to be in a much better position because you know where their models have to be. And then by knowing that, you can also counter how they play, which I kind of discussed a little bit in the previous episode as well, is just knowing where your opponent has to stand and positioning accordingly to kind of block that as best you can. And going back to your all-comers list. So typically the way to build the best balanced list you can look at is, again, going through your own models as you're building the list and say, what are my weaknesses? Like, what is this unit have a problem against? Whether it be being shot at range because you have unyielding, so okay, I don't get my extra armor from taking these attacks. Whether it be magic, or maybe I'm slow and I get out threatened by a bunch of things. So you want to try to complement that in such a way where if I am bringing slower units, bring longer range guns to buffer, obviously, those units getting in and giving them more time. Where how many times in games have you played where your opponent runs up just outside of your 10-inch melee threat and just stares at you? So at least this way you have guns that can reach out and actually punish your opponent from basically doing that to you. And it gives you still space for your slow units to maneuver and get to the scenario without in turn just being aggressively pushed off by the units that hit as hard as you and threat just 2 or 3 inches farther than you. So you're able to take up some more of that space that way. Or in the vice versa of I have slower jacks and they take time to get into the fight. So now I'm looking to bring faster units to get my units up into the scenario and to start piece trading with those to buy time for my heavies to basically advance up and get their positions into the scenario. So that's kind of that complement of trying to find where your weak points are and balance them out with strong points of other models, whether that be battle group models or battle engines or things like that. Also, you're looking for like consistency. I'm a massive stickler for that, and that's one of the reasons why I love Harusk so much. The consistency of dice in this game is one of the the most frustrating things, but also one of the greatest rewarding situation where if you roll a super hot roll when you need it, you're over the moon. But obviously, like if you're rolling that, I need a 4, and you roll a 3, you're like, why did that happen? So it's the consistency of trying to find ways to mitigate the variance of dice is huge for a lot of lists, especially a lot of well-balanced lists, where it doesn't necessarily matter as much what I roll because I have so many built-in redundancies, whether it be the Ghoul Callers in Grimkin or the reroll from Harusk, or even like just modified fixers as far as running Carnage or any of these other hit buffs, or damage buffs that can augment the dice, so they don't play nearly as big of a role as they would normally do. So being able to basically predict what your outcome is going to be before you commit a model is just huge in this game. And just not having to rely on like, oh, I hope I roll well here, and then not pan out. That's another thing you want to look at for when you're building your list is how can I mitigate that variance. And then also another thing you want to look for when you're building your list is terrain. I mean, terrain is huge, and it's can be incredibly impactful in a game. And if you don't have a plan for how am I going to move through these terrain pieces before you even see them, you're going to have a bad time. You want to make sure you have at least 2 or 3 fast movers that can move through terrain decent amount of Pathfinder in the list. I mean, not every army has access to Pathfinder, and that's kind of where the command cards come into play a little bit as well. And we'll get more into that a little later, as far as like how best to select your command cards and what you're looking at more so with that. But you're wanting to basically give yourself as many tools as possible. And it's not so much, like I said, for the trying to answer what your opponent's doing. It's giving you variants and options during the course of a game that you can use to your advantage to leverage certain things at certain moments of the game. Is whether that be being able to slam models that you can't kill out of the zone, or whether that be just being able to, I can't really hit that with a bunch of my stuff. I'm gonna try to knock it down. So just having those extra outs to try to give you that leverage that you need during the course of a game. And then, so as far as the list structure too, sorry, I know that someone had mentioned earlier when I kind of put out their feelers as far as what topics we should be discussing today, like support bloat and how to basically fight against what is too much and that. So typically, what I look at as far as again, going back to the list construction, your stars and whatnot, or your featured jacks or beasts or whatever have you. Typically, that's going to take up roughly 35% of your army as far as what you're looking at there, and then your meat and potatoes as far as your second your supporting cast and things of that nature will be the largest. What I said earlier about 45 to 55% of your army is going to make up that, and then your support typically, as far as, and I say support as far as pure support that doesn't really have a function other than I'm going to make these models that my other models that I've alluded to better. Like, you don't want these things in combat, because if you have to have them make an attack and kill a model, those models that you're like, I hope I never have to do that because I don't know how it's going to go. Those models that you don't even know they're Matt and Rat because you've never made an attack with them. Those are the models I'm talking about as far as the support models. Like those, typically those models, you're only going to want 10 to 15% of your list composition to be those types of models. And like and not every, even there's very few of these models in the game currently, and even in some situations, your spell rack and different spells you can have can augment those models becoming combat units because of battle lust or some of those other damage dealing spells, like in situations like guardians in dusk, where they're only POW 10s. They're typically their biggest service is to shield guard and just keep your other stuff alive. But with battle lust and desperate pace and things like those models can in turn do some work, maybe do a third to a half of a heavy, somewhere in there. But typically those models, their main function obviously is to support your army, and typically just become ghosts and wraiths and all of that. But like dusk is value city as far as void engines go. I love that model, by the way. It is a little bit off on a tangent, but that model is awesome. Again, I know I've been talking for a little while. Does anyone have any questions, anything they want to, as far as bring up, anything that they would like to be explained a little further or touched on, anything? Like I said, this is the time.
Hey, so hi, I'm Brian. I put up that bloat question.
Yep.
I guess I just want to talk about like finding that heart or theme of an army, right? And like I understand like the math aspect a little bit. You know what I mean? Like you can see how fast they go. You can really see how like accurate they hit. But as far as those armies that aren't super apparent, right? Like you kind of have to dig as far as their worth. I can think about
sure.
like
did you have a specific army in mind that you're referring to?
so Dusk is the new one, but I know that there are other armies kind of like Menoth and like Scorn that people usually kind of like not meme, but have that kind of idea where they're like, well, this is kind of like the value is not obvious and apparent. You know what I mean?
You're right. Okay.
I certainly come from Crix where I'm kind of used to just like I layer buffs and auras to make sure that I can like get there. And then whatever survives at the end of the table, I know can hit, right? And like that's usually where my mind goes as far as like building a list, being like, I know I'm going to lose half of it up the table, but whatever's left, I can do work with. And then coming off that mindset, and I know other armies have other values, but like, what am I looking for here when I want something that doesn't have, obvious implications? It's like, oh, hey, this character Jack is Mat 8 and does a POW 20 off the jump and is arm 18 and has a shield. Like what are we hunting for here?
Yeah. So in those situations, as far as in armies that don't have, if you're struggling to find the army identity, or just struggling to, like you said, kind of find where those lines are and what this army does best, just start basically looking through your units and your models. And like I said, your average stat line of a model in Mark IV, as far as like units go, are defense 12, armor 16, somewhere in there. Yeah, mat 6, mat 7, speed 6, 2-inch reach. Like you're looking basically for like the average profile of a unit or a model, and say, okay, like what models do I have that are slightly above that curve, and just like I said, okay, I have this unit that's basically that one tick above like the average, or I have this jack that is that mat 8 pow 18. Like that's a significant, obviously, spike in a lot of situations where there's not many heavies that are mat 8 or even like out the jump pow 20. So like those can be obviously your jumping off point for those lists. Like, okay, like these are my models that are above the norm, and then how do I amplify that even farther to get it even farther from the norm, to make them even better, and then your rest of your list is supporting that. Where in situation with Dusk, I think a lot of their power, especially with I don't recall his name, but Spider-Man, the ability to project in that army with Cav is huge. With if you're racking Mirage, if you're racking, especially with his feet and that, like, you're able to project with desperate pace, phenomenally well. The other big appearance with Dusk is their ability to just contest and hang in the fight. Like I said, I alluded to earlier, the Void Engine, like killing a model in with a Guardian, getting a second life as a Wraith, and just running that thing somewhere into a zone and incorporeal, and like just that in general is a very strong mechanic as well, where you have all these extra solos, and not only do these solos do work, but they're also can be fairly problematic for some armies to deal with if they don't have magic weapons or access to a bunch of magic weapons over the course of a game. Because, like I said, Blessing only can use it once, so you're being able to keep that engine alive. The longer the game goes, the more value you generate from some of those models. Where the first few turns may not be as beneficial, but if you're able to keep those models going longer, as your opponent's army thins, they're not going to have nearly as many tools as they did on turns 2 and turns 3 to continue to combat what your army does and what your army does well. So that's just something to keep in mind, where that's typically what I'm looking for when I start a new army is, all right, what does this army have that is above the normal average curve of like what every faction has? And that's kind of where the jumping off point for me is, where where that faction identity starts coming from. Any other questions?
I don't have so much as a question as I definitely have some opinions about list building if anybody cares to talk about them.
Oh yeah, I mean, sure, by all means. Like I said, it's an open discussion. You can share away, please.
Right on. So, how's my audio first before I get talking?
No, your audio is fine.
Great. My first consideration whenever I talk to somebody about building a list is know your player level, know your player skill. The reason for that is I will not suggest a beginner list to an experienced player, and I won't suggest an experienced list to a beginner player. And the reason for that is the reason most players lose games isn't because they have a terrible list. You can win games with a terrible list and have exceptional player skill. The reason is they don't know how to apply the tools properly. And so as a teacher, the first thing I do is I say, all right, what are the baseline things that you are trying to function with? And let's learn those things. So if it's I'm learning the Warjacks of this faction, then we're going to build a Warjack-centric list. If it's I'm going to learn the units of this faction, it's going to be a unit-centric list. And then we're going to apply those. And you're going to get that practical experience, because the second step from that is building a module. It's this model does this. Its job is to crack armor. Its job is to hit high defense. Its job is to answer spells. And then, does it need assistance in that algorithm? So, can it crack a heavy, from full to dead? No? Then it needs assistance. What kind of assistance am I going to give it? Something that can also do damage so that, collectively they can kill the heavy? Or is it something that's going to buff that thing so it takes it to the level that I need it to mathematically, right? And then you have a pod that you can play and say, all right, A plus B equals C. Armor cracking plus heavy equals dead heavy, which is the goal. And then once you learn to apply those tools, you look for the finesse in a list. How do I do this exceptionally? And can I do it with subtlety? And so to do something exceptionally, you have to look at what the norm is, what the baseline is, and then is there anything above that? In Magic, they used to refer to it as the Jedi curve, right? What is undervalued or overstated? What is something that is better than good? Because you can take good to great, but you can take great to amazing. Good is the enemy of great most of the time on the table. So once you figured out what something does, you can compare it apples to oranges. If this is my armor cracker, can I do it better? Well, this is the best armor cracker I have. But is it the most efficient? Oh, I can do the same job with these multiple models, and now I can spread those points out across the board and score me. Scoring is the foundation of a competitive game. I'm not just trying to win by pushing models forward or even just applying the correct tools to the right situation, but I'm trying to outplay my opponent. And so to do so, I have to participate in all the elements of the game. Participating in the elements of the game means that you have to have things that both function in the scenario and function within the exchange of models. The way to win that exchange is to trade up. So the old chess metaphor, to take something that is either not doing its job because its job is no longer needed, or be a lower valued model and trade it for a higher valued model. So these are decisions you have to make throughout the game, and knowing how to apply a model and what a model's value is or how much above the curve it is informs those decisions. So once you've learned those two base things, we look for the opportunity to experience a big trade-up. Earlier in the kind of pre-show, post-show Primecast, we were talking about the Siege Terrask. It's one of those models that gets maligned for not being able to perform at the level of a heavy. But that's kind of a false comparison. Yeah, you can get a cheap heavy, but that's a different role. If you trade a heavy for a heavy, then you're looking to only gain a couple valued points. But if I trade a Siege Terrask for a heavy, maybe I gain 8 or 9 points. And I don't care if my 9-point solo died taking about 9 points of work back, which is about what a Siege Terrask can do if it's just shooting solos or punching value targets. But in return, I take the thing that they needed to dedicate to kill it. But the beta strike, the end game, right, is to play into the turns that your opponent didn't plan for or that you outplayed for. So in these situations, if I trade a Siege Terrask for your heavy, and you run out of things that can crack my Tyrant with a shield, then I have effectively won that side of the table. And once you create situations that are unwinnable for an opponent, the scenario develops itself. It's also the way most players lose like an advantage. I've now traded up. I have more models than you, but I don't know how to place them properly, and my opponent can win with just a few models because they focus on the scenario more. So the goal is to not just be trading up, but to trade into relevant positions. And so this gets into your modules again. Is this module meant to be an offensive module or a defensive module? Because when it comes to trading, some things are harder to trade for and some things are better to trade with. And you're trying to create that balance on the table that's always best for you. So when you're looking at an army, those are the fundamentals you're looking for. Is this my trading piece, or is this my beta wave? Is this my turn 7 model? Because some models gain value as the game goes. That's kind of my fundamentals of list building concepts. Personally, when I explore a faction, and that's a lot of the times what I do, I explore from casters backwards. That way I focus on whatever the source of the list is, the coherency of it. That way that model is emphasizing the best, taking that great to amazing. And then once I learn what that amazing looks like, once I learn the roles and how they're applied, I focus on trying to emphasize that until I've learned it so well that I can make changes on it. When it comes to master level players, a lot of times the strategy they make their own is only by making a variation on some other strategy that was already out there. And in chess, sometimes that's hundreds of years, all to develop a slight pawn change. So it takes understanding the subtlety of an army, that experience, and then saying, here's the variation I would like to make because in my local play group and the event that I'm doing, whatever it happens to be, I understand that, and it's the same way in cooking, right? You can take a great recipe and then go, I know this group really likes salt. I'm going to add a little bit more salt. Oh, I know this group hates cilantro. Not putting cilantro in this. And so you can focus on those varying degrees of this versus that. But I think for the most part, most players experience the game in the beginner to intermediate level. And very few players honestly experience it at the expert level. But we often reach for what the expert level player is cooking when we haven't learned how to cook in our own kitchens yet. And so the best thing to do is learn what your player level is, what you're trying to experience out of that game. Take that journey, and then when you get to the point where you can look at the experienced players list and understand what you're looking at, then you can start to make variations on it and say, hey, I really like this model. I think it might serve this role better. And that experimentation, that's the kind of bleeding edge of list building, is not what the best player is playing, but what you think that variation is that works for you.
Yeah, no, that's a perfect and that's I love that. That you're iterating off of what works for you and not so much. And I preach that all the time as well, which is it's great. Where that playing at your player's skill is phenomenal. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves too. And we kind of talked about this a little bit in the player assistance portion of the channel, was people that put their list on the internet and say, okay, can you give me thoughts and feedback and all of this? And you don't know what their meta looks like, number one, what their player skill is, number two, what their model availability is, or maybe they're playing with what they own. So a lot of that is, it's very hard to give feedback to someone where you don't know what the basis of the game they're at. So I definitely really enjoy you bringing that up, where play to your level. Don't try to just take what's winning and try to pilot that as best you can, because in most cases you're not going to play it at that same level, because you're not going to know why that list was initially created, what it's created to play against, and all of the tools and things that that player is trying to leverage to get that to that point. Does anybody else have anything they want to weigh in on or talk about? As I said, if no one else has any input, I think that's a pretty good stopping point for today. Like I said, I'll definitely be again on the pages and whatnot, again trying to formulate other questions and kind of things that we should touch on, and how to raise up the community to get everybody to increasing their game. That's ultimately what this is for. Just getting you to that next level and getting just the hype about playing Mark IV, because it's a brand new game, bold new game, and I'm super enjoying it. And I the fact that we've got so many people here willing to listen and talk about it means that we're definitely making strides in the right direction. So again, I appreciate you guys taking the time to sit down and talk with me, and we'll do this again sometime soon. Okay, thank you.